There is a hillside I keep returning to, in memory, though I only stood on it once. It had burned the summer before, not a small fire, the kind that clears brush and moves on, but the kind that takes everything, that turns a forest into a landscape of black spears standing in gray ash. I remember thinking, walking through it, that this is what the end of the world must look like. Silence, no birdsong, the smell of char still in the ground a year later. And then I looked down, green, thin, stubborn threads of green, pushing up through the ash in long lines exactly where the heat had been most intense. I would learn later that some pine cones in that region don't open on their own. They need fire, the specific violent heat of a wildfire, to melt the resin sealing their scales shut. The tree's own reproduction depends on its destruction. Without the fire, the seeds stay locked away forever. I don't tell you this because I think it resolves anything. I tell you this because it's the shape of the question I want to spend the next while sitting inside. Can something that destroys also be the thing that makes new life possible? And if it can, does that make the destruction good? Or does it just make it useful, which is a very different thing? These are old questions, older than any of us, but I don't think we've finished asking them. Let me start where the problem itself starts. Not with an answer, but with a not. If there is some higher order to existence, a God, a governing intelligence, a moral structure to the universe, and that order is both all-powerful and entirely good, then a very old and very simple question follows it everywhere. Why does suffering exist unchecked at the scale that it does? I think of Epicurus here, writing more than 2,000 years ago, laying out the dilemma in its starkest form. Either this higher power wants to prevent evil and cannot, in which case it isn't all-powerful, or it can prevent evil and chooses not to, in which case it isn't good, or it is both willing and able, in which case where does evil come from at all, or it is neither willing nor able, in which case why call it divine? Each branch of that logic leads somewhere uncomfortable. That's the trap. It was built to be inescapable. Centuries later, Augustine of Hippo tried to slip the trap from a different angle. Before his conversion, he had spent years among the Manichaeans, who believed evil was a real substance, a rival force locked in combat with good. Augustine came to reject that entirely. Evil, he decided, is not a thing. It has no substance of its own. It's a privation, an absence, a hollowing out of a good that was already there. A wound is not a substance added to the body. It's a disruption of the body's wholeness. Blindness is not a thing you have. It's the absence of a thing you were supposed to have. In this view, evil was never created, because it was never a something to be created. It's what's left when goodness is corrupted or withheld. And the corrupting, in Augustine's account, traces back to the free choices of creatures. And then there's Leibniz, who gave this entire field of inquiry its name, theodicy. The justification of the divine in the face of a suffering world. Leibniz argued that a perfectly wise and perfectly good creator would necessarily have surveyed every possible world it could bring into being, every combination of natural laws, every configuration of joy and suffering, and chosen the best one, not a perfect one, the best possible one, which means, on his account, that the suffering we see is not a flaw in the design. It's the necessary cost of a world that is, on balance, better than every alternative that could have existed instead. I find that idea both beautiful and almost unbearable. Voltaire clearly found it unbearable too. His satire in Candide, with its relentlessly optimistic professor insisting all is for the best while catastrophe piles on catastrophe, was a direct answer to Leibniz and not a gentle one. Because there's something that can feel obscene about being told, in the middle of a tragedy, that this is the best of all possible arrangements. Tell that to someone standing in the ash. So I don't think any of these three thinkers closed the question. I think they each hand it to us in a different shape. Epicurus hands us the dilemma. Augustine hands us a way of understanding evil as absence rather than substance. Leibniz hands us a calculation we can't verify, because we can't see the other possible worlds to compare against. All three, in their way, are trying to answer the same thing I was trying to answer on that hillside. Is the fire part of the forest's design, or just something the forest survives? I want to be careful here, because this is where I think a lot of well-meaning ideas curdle into something less honest. We've all heard some version of the phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's comforting. It's also, I think, only sometimes true, and dangerous when we forget the sometimes. There is real psychological research behind the idea that people can grow through adversity. Psychologists call it post-traumatic growth, and it describes something genuine. People who, after a serious hardship, report a deepened sense of meaning, closer relationships, a clearer sense of what matters. I don't want to dismiss that. I've seen it in people I know. Loss that taught patience, illness that taught presence, failure that eventually taught direction. But I think we tell this story more often than it's actually true, and I think we tell it selectively. We hear from the person who survived the hardship and grew. We don't hear as often from the person who was simply diminished by it, who came out smaller, more afraid, less whole. Survivorship shapes the stories that reach us. The one who nearly died and found a new appreciation for life gets the interview. The one who didn't survive it intact does not get to give one. So when I hear the idea that hardship builds character, I want to hold it at arm's length rather than embrace it fully. Hardship can build character. It can also just hurt someone permanently with no silver lining attached, and I think it does that far more often than our stories about resilience like to admit. Suffering doesn't owe anyone a lesson. Sometimes it teaches, sometimes it simply takes. What I find more honest is this: growth through hardship seems to depend enormously on what surrounds the hardship. Whether a person has support, safety, time, someone to talk to, a reason to keep going. Suffering alone doesn't build strength. Suffering plus support sometimes does, which means that when we praise resilience, we might actually be praising the conditions around a person more than the suffering itself. Here is where I think the sharpest line in this whole discussion needs to be drawn. It's true, historically, that terrible things have sometimes been followed by real progress. But followed by is doing enormous work in that sentence, and I want to slow down on it, because I think it's where good faith philosophy quietly turns into something else. There's a difference between saying evil sometimes produces good and saying evil is therefore good. A disease can lead researchers toward a breakthrough. That doesn't make the disease good. It makes the researchers resourceful in the face of something bad. A war can accelerate a technology. That doesn't redeem the war. The outcome and the event are not the same moral object, and I think collapsing them together is where this idea becomes dangerous. I think of the argument Dostoevsky put in the mouth of one of his characters, one of the most devastating passages in that whole tradition of thought. He doesn't deny that a future harmony might exist, some grand reconciliation at the end of history where every wrong is somehow balanced. What he refuses is the price of admission. He describes the suffering of a single innocent child and says, in effect, I don't care what beautiful world you build afterward. If it was built on that child's unanswered tears, I return the ticket. I want no part of a harmony that requires that as payment. I think that's the strongest objection to everything I've discussed so far, and I don't think it can be argued away. Because the moment we say this suffering was worth it, look what came after. We've made a trade on someone else's behalf, using currency that was never ours to spend. The people who suffered didn't get a vote in whether their pain was worth it. We're the ones who get to feel that it worked out from a safe distance afterward. And this is exactly the reasoning that has been used again and again through history to excuse real cruelty. The idea that some future good justifies present harm has been the architecture behind atrocities as much as it's been the architecture behind genuine sacrifice. The two can look identical from the inside of the justification. That should terrify us a little. It terrifies me a little. So maybe the honest position is this: some evils can produce good outcomes without being necessary and without being excused. The good that follows doesn't reach backward in time and cleanse what happened. It just means something was salvaged from wreckage, which is not nothing, but it is also not redemption. Go back to that hillside with me for a moment. Standing in the ash, a year seemed like a long time. It wasn't. From the perspective of the forest, which thinks, if it thinks at all, in centuries, a year is barely the space between one breath and the next. What looked to me like devastation was, at the scale the forest operates on, mid-sentence. I'd walked in during a pause and mistaken it for the ending. I wonder how much of our judgment about suffering suffers from exactly that mistake, reading a single page and believing we've understood the whole book. We experience events as they happen to us, in the order we experience them, at the pace of a single human life, which is a strange and narrow window through which to judge something as vast as history or nature or whatever governs either. There's an old image from the book of Job that I think about often, regardless of what anyone believes about its theology. Job, having lost everything, demands an explanation from the heavens, and the answer he receives isn't a justification, it's a question turned back on him. Some version of, "Were you there when the world was built? When its scale was first measured out? When the stars themselves were still singing at the beginning of things?" It isn't comforting, exactly. It's closer to being reminded of your own scale. You are asking a question that assumes you could hold the whole picture in your mind, and you were never built to hold it. I find that both humbling and a little unsettling, because I think this idea cuts both ways. On one hand, there's something true in it. Genuine humility about the limits of a single human perspective seems correct to me. We really can't see the whole shape of history from inside it. On the other hand, I don't think "you can't understand" should ever be allowed to fully silence someone's grief. Telling a person mid-tragedy that they simply lack the perspective to judge their own suffering is not comfort. It can be a way of refusing to sit with them in it. So I hold both of these at once. We probably are too limited to see the whole pattern, and that limitation should never be used to talk someone out of what they're feeling on the page they're currently reading. Here's a thought experiment I keep circling. Imagine a world engineered so that no one could ever choose cruelty. Every path toward harm is simply closed off, not restrained by conscience, but structurally impossible, the way it's impossible to choose to breathe underwater. Would the people in that world be good? I don't think they would be anything. I think they'd be incapable of the category entirely. Goodness, as we understand it, seems to require the live possibility of its opposite. A person who helps a stranger because helping is literally the only available action hasn't done something virtuous. They've just moved along the only track that existed. Virtue seems to require a fork in the road, and a fork in the road means the wrong branch has to genuinely be there, genuinely walkable. This is the oldest defense of a good creator alongside a world containing evil, that evil is the shadow cost of freedom, and freedom is worth the cost because a world of moral robots isn't actually a moral world at all. I find this argument genuinely persuasive for a specific category of evil, the evil that comes from human choice. Cruelty, betrayal, violence, greed, those all trace back to a chooser, but it doesn't fully cover the other kind of evil, and I think this is where the argument runs into trouble. What free choice produced the earthquake, the childhood illness, the drought? No one chose those. There's no fork in the road, no agent making a decision, just the raw, unchosen suffering built into the structure of a physical world. Free will can explain why cruelty is possible. It struggles to explain why a virus is possible. That gap is real, and I don't think it fully closes, though it's the gap Leibniz was reaching toward with his idea of metaphysical evil, the notion that any finite created world, just by virtue of being finite rather than infinite like its source, will necessarily contain some measure of imperfection built into its very structure, with no villain required at all. I promised I'd come back to the hillside, so let me finish the thought I started with. Those pine cones I mentioned, the ones sealed shut with resin until fire melts it open, are called serotinous, and they're not a rare exception in nature. They're closer to a pattern. Forests in fire-prone regions are often not just resistant to burning, some of them depend on it. Without periodic fire, certain forests become overcrowded, weakened, vulnerable to disease and to far larger, more catastrophic fires later. The smaller destructions prevent the total one. Zoom out further, and the pattern keeps repeating. Every living thing that dies becomes material for something else. Decomposition isn't a sad postscript to life. It's the mechanism that keeps every ecosystem fed. A forest floor is, quite literally, built out of everything that has already died in it. And zoom out further still, to the deepest destructions in the planet's history. The asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs was, by any measure, a catastrophe on a scale we can barely picture, and it was also the event that emptied enough ecological space for small mammals to expand into, eventually, unbelievably, becoming us. I want to be careful with this one, though, because I think it's tempting to lean on nature as if it proves something moral, and I don't think it does. Nature isn't kind, it isn't cruel either. A forest fire doesn't intend anything. It has no opinion about the seeds it frees or the nests it burns along the way. When I look at the ash to green cycle and feel like I'm looking at wisdom, I think what I'm actually looking at is pattern, dressed up by my own mind to look like meaning. The pattern is real. Whether it's wise is a question I'm importing, not one nature is answering. Still, I don't think that fully empties the observation of its weight. Even if nature doesn't intend renewal, renewal keeps happening anyway, structurally, reliably, at every scale we can measure. That has to tell us something about the kind of universe we're standing in, even if it can't tell us that universe is good. Human history seems to run on a similar rhythm, though here, unlike in the forest, there are choices involved, which makes the story heavier, not lighter. Some of the deepest social reforms in modern history arrived only after periods of visible, undeniable injustice. Movements against slavery, against child labor, against the worst abuses of early industrialization, all of them gathered force in direct response to suffering that had finally become impossible to look away from. The reform didn't erase what came before it. It was, in every case, a response to a wrong that should never have needed a response in the first place. Medicine tells a similar story. Some of the clearest advances in public health followed directly from outbreaks that killed enormous numbers of people. The mapping of a cholera outbreak in 19th century London helped establish that disease spreads through contaminated water rather than bad air, a discovery that reshaped how cities build sanitation systems to this day. Epidemics have, again and again, forced the development of the very tools eventually used to prevent the next one, and conflict, for all its horror, has repeatedly acted as a strange accelerant for technology. Wartime pressure compressed decades of engineering progress into a handful of years, in fields from aviation to early computing to medicine. Necessity, in its most brutal form, has a way of forcing invention that peacetime alone often doesn't. But I want to end this section exactly where I ended the third one, because I think it needs repeating. None of this cleans the ledger. The reform doesn't unhappen the injustice. The medical advance doesn't unhappen the deaths that preceded it. What we're looking at in every one of these cases isn't proof that the suffering was worth it. It's proof that human beings are remarkably good at building something out of wreckage. Those are not the same finding, even though they're easy to mistake for each other. I think about Viktor Frankl sometimes, a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps of the Second World War and came out of that experience with an idea he spent the rest of his life developing, that meaning, not pleasure, is the thing human beings most need to stay intact. He observed that the prisoners who seemed most able to endure the unendurable were often the ones who held on to some sense of purpose beyond the present moment, a person waiting for them, a task unfinished, a reason to see tomorrow. I want to be very careful with how I say this next part, because I think it's easy to hear it as something it isn't. Frankl was not saying suffering is good, or that the camps served some higher purpose, or that people should seek out pain to find meaning. He was describing something narrower and more human, that even inside horror that should never have existed, some people found a way to keep an inner life alive by attaching it to something beyond their own pain. That's not a justification for the horror. It's an observation about what people are sometimes capable of within it, which is a very different thing. I see smaller versions of this everywhere once I start looking for it. People who've lost someone to a particular illness and go on to build support networks for other families going through the same thing. People who've lived through preventable tragedies and become advocates for the exact safety measure that might have prevented theirs. Grief redirected into campaigns that change laws so that a loss becomes, eventually, someone else's protection. None of that erases the original loss. The person is not better off for having lost what they lost, but something in them found a direction to point the pain in, rather than letting it simply sit there with nowhere to go. I don't think this happens automatically. and I don't think it happens to everyone, and I think it's important to say that plainly. Some pain just stays pain. Some people never find a direction to point it in, and that's not a failure of character. It's simply not owed to anyone, the way healing isn't owed on any particular schedule. But when transformation does happen, I don't think it's the suffering doing the transforming. I think it's the person doing something remarkable with material they never should have been given in the first place. There's a quieter, more abstract version of this whole question that I want to sit with before I try to close any of this out. Could we even recognize courage in a world that contained no danger? Courage seems to require the genuine possibility of harm. Otherwise, it's not courage, it's just motion. Could we recognize mercy in a world with no wrongdoing to forgive? Mercy seems to need an offense standing behind it, or the word collapses into something else entirely. Justice, patience, forgiveness, so many of the concepts we consider highest seem to be defined in relation to something we'd call, in some sense, evil. Remove the backdrop and the word starts to lose its edges. That's the classical argument, and I think it holds real weight, but I've started to wonder if it's actually pointing at the wrong culprit. Maybe what these concepts require isn't evil specifically. Maybe what they require is simply limitation, contrast, stakes, the possibility that things could go wrong, and the effort it takes to make sure they don't. Evil is one route to that contrast, a severe, tragic, often unjustifiable route, but I'm not fully convinced it's the only conceivable one. A world with mere difficulty, mere uncertainty, mere finitude might generate enough friction for courage and patience and care to mean something, without requiring cruelty or catastrophe to make the friction happen. I offer that not as an answer, because I don't think I have one, but as a way of loosening the grip of the original question. Maybe good doesn't need evil. Maybe it only needs a world where things are genuinely at stake, and evil just happens to be the most dramatic, most devastating way that stakes show up in the world we actually have. So I want to end where I think all of this has been quietly leading, without pretending I can resolve it, because I don't think it resolves. Is evil a permanent feature of existence? Something built into the structure of any world complex enough to contain freedom, contrast, and finite creatures inside it? Or is it a temporary condition, a wound that a long enough timeline eventually heals, the way ash eventually becomes soil, and soil eventually becomes forest again? I've turned this over enough times now to know I can't answer it. What I can say is that both possibilities sit uncomfortably close to something true. Evil does keep recurring in every era, in every civilization, in forms old and new, which makes it look less like an accident and more like a permanent feature of anything complex enough to have freedom in it at all. And yet, good does keep recurring too. After every collapse I can find in the historical record, something rebuilds, not because the collapse was good, not because it was necessary, just because building seems to be one of the things that finite, suffering, freely choosing creatures do, over and over, whether or not the universe owes them the outcome. Maybe that's the only honest place to leave this. Not a resolution, a pattern, observed without a verdict attached to it. The fire happened. It shouldn't have needed to happen for the forest to be beautiful again. And yet, somehow, impossibly, stubbornly, the green came back anyway. I don't know if that's grace or just biology doing what biology does. I've stopped being sure there's a difference.